Ever wondered what it was really like to be a medieval knight? Did they actually live by all those chivalric codes we see in movies? The world of knighthood was stranger than you might think, filled with bizarre rules that would make even the most dedicated cosplayer think twice about living the authentic knight life. Number 8. Never bathe naked with other knights. Did knights really have rules about taking baths together? Yes, they absolutely did. Medieval chivalric codes had some surprisingly specific guidelines about knights' bathing habits that would raise eyebrows today. Knights were specifically instructed never to bathe naked in the presence of other knights. This wasn't just about modesty or privacy. It was considered a matter of honor and dignity. Knights were expected to maintain a certain level of decorum at all times, even during something as mundane as bathing. The rule stemmed from the belief that a knight should always present himself with dignity and respect, never appearing vulnerable or immodest, even among his brothers in arms. Some chivalric manuals went into surprising detail about this, specifying that knights should wear light garments while bathing in company and avert their eyes when others were dressing or undressing. What makes this rule particularly interesting is that communal bathing was actually quite common during medieval times. Public bathhouses existed throughout Europe, and it wasn't unusual for people to bathe together. Yet knights were held to a higher standard. They were expected to maintain their dignity and composure even in these situations. The bathing restrictions didn't stop there. Some codes of chivalry even dictated how frequently a knight should bathe, not too often, as excessive bathing was thought to weaken the body, what herbs to use in the bath water for purification, and prayers to recite while washing. These elaborate bathing rituals were seen as purification ceremonies, cleansing both body and soul. For knights on campaign, these rules became even more complicated. When clean water was scarce and privacy non-existent, knights had to get creative to maintain their dignity while following these bathing protocols. Some would set up makeshift privacy screens with cloaks, or seek out secluded spots away from camp. Others might forego full bathing entirely, opting instead for a quick wipe down with a damp cloth, all to avoid the forbidden, naked communal bath. Number 7. Always wear a long-sleeved tunic at the dinner table. Could your dinner attire actually be a matter of chivalric importance? For medieval knights, what they wore to meals wasn't just a fashion choice. It was a strict requirement outlined in their codes of conduct. Knights were specifically required to wear long-sleeved tunics while dining, especially at formal occasions and feasts. This rule might seem arbitrary to modern readers, but it served several important purposes in medieval society. First, long sleeves were a mark of status and refinement. Only the nobility and knights could afford the extra fabric required for long flowing sleeves, making them an instant visual indicator of one's social standing. Appearing at dinner with short sleeves, or worse yet, bare arms, was considered extremely uncouth and would immediately mark someone as a peasant or laborer. Beyond the social signaling, long sleeves actually served practical purposes at the dinner table. They could be used to wipe one's mouth when necessary, napkins weren't always available, and they protected others from having to view a knight's bare arms while eating, something considered highly improper. The sleeves could also be carefully folded or pushed back to prevent them from dragging in food while still maintaining the required coverage. The enforcement of this rule was taken quite seriously. Knights who showed up to formal dinners improperly dressed could be denied their place at the table or subjected to mockery and gossip. In some courts, repeated violations might even result in temporary banishment from future feasts, a serious social penalty in a culture where shared meals were critical networking opportunities. What's particularly fascinating about this rule is how it intersected with other aspects of knightly life. Knights were expected to be ready for battle or duty at all times, yet they also needed to maintain these elaborate dress codes. This meant that even on campaign, a knight would need to pack appropriate dining attire alongside his armor and weapons. Imagine preparing for potential combat while also worrying about having the right sleeve length for dinner. Number 6. Never sleep in a soft bed. Are you too comfortable right now? Medieval knights would disapprove. One of the strangest rules in various codes of chivalry forbade knights from sleeping in soft, comfortable beds. This wasn't just a recommendation, it was considered an important part of maintaining a knight's physical toughness and moral discipline. According to these guidelines, a proper knight should sleep on hard surfaces, with minimal bedding and comfort. Some manuals suggested wooden planks covered with a thin layer of straw or a basic mat. Luxurious feather beds, plush mattresses, and excessive pillows were explicitly discouraged as they were thought to make a knight soft, both physically and mentally. The reasoning behind this odd restriction tied directly into the knight's primary purpose as a warrior. Knights needed to be ready for the harsh conditions of campaign life, where they might sleep on the ground, in tents, or even in their armor. Becoming accustomed to comfort was seen as dangerous. A knight who grew too used to soft beds might become ineffective when forced to endure the rigors of war. This rule also had spiritual dimensions. Many chivalric codes were heavily influenced by religious ideals, particularly Christian concepts of self-denial and asceticism. Just as monks practiced bodily mortification to strengthen their souls, knights were expected to endure physical discomforts to temper their spirits. Sleeping on hard surfaces was considered a form of ongoing penance that kept a knight humble and mindful of his duties. The prohibition against comfortable sleeping arrangements created some interesting practical challenges. Wealthy knights who owned castles or manor houses would have had access to the best beds money could buy, yet were expected to forsake them in favor of Spartan arrangements. Some solved this contradiction by maintaining separate sleeping quarters, luxurious guest rooms for visitors and family, with a much simpler chamber for themselves. When traveling or visiting other castles, knights faced an awkward dilemma. Refusing the comfortable bed offered by a host could be seen as an insult, yet accepting it meant violating their chivalric code. Some knights reportedly carried their own simple sleeping mats to use atop the beds they were offered, maintaining the appearance of accepting hospitality while secretly adhering to their austere sleeping requirements. Number 5. Never eat garlic before meeting a lady. Did knights really have breath-freshening rules? When it came to interactions between knights and noblewomen, chivalric codes didn't leave anything to chance, including dietary restrictions. Knights were specifically forbidden from eating garlic, onions, leeks, and other strong-smelling foods before any planned encounter with a lady. This rule might seem comically trivial compared to codes governing battlefield conduct or religious devotion, but it was taken quite seriously. In the close quarters of castle life, where knights might be engaged in conversation, dancing, or other courtly activities with noblewomen, bad breath was considered not just unpleasant but actively disrespectful. The prohibition against garlic was particularly strict. Despite garlic's popularity in medieval cooking and its reputation for medicinal properties, knights were expected to abstain completely if they anticipated being in the presence of ladies. Some chronicles even mention knights fasting or subsisting on bread and mild foods before important social events to ensure their breath remained inoffensive. What makes this rule especially interesting is how it reflects the dual nature of knightly identity. On the battlefield, knights were expected to be fierce warriors, enduring all manner of physical hardships and injuries. Yet in courtly settings, they were expected to transform into refined gentlemen, attentive to minute details of social etiquette like their breath's freshness. The garlic restriction also had class implications. Garlic and onions were staples in peasant diets across medieval Europe, cheap and readily available foods that added flavor to otherwise bland meals. By abstaining from these common foods, knights distinguished themselves from lower classes, literally distancing themselves from smelling like ordinary people. For knights who had grown up accustomed to flavoring their food with these pungent ingredients, this restriction could be genuinely difficult to maintain. Some medieval manuscripts include recipes for herbal mouth fresheners specifically designed for knights, featuring mint, anise, and other pleasant-smelling herbs that could counteract any lingering food odors. Number 4. Never turn your back on the king, even in the bathroom. How far did loyalty to the king actually go? For medieval knights, the answer was everywhere, including the royal bathroom. One of the stranger rules of chivalry required that knights never turn their back on their sovereign, and this rule applied in all circumstances, creating some particularly awkward situations in private settings. The principle behind this prohibition was straightforward. Turning one's back on the king could be interpreted as disrespect or worse, potential treachery. A knight was expected to maintain a position of readiness and deference at all times, facing the monarch to show constant vigilance and loyalty. But the practical application of this rule led to some genuinely bizarre scenarios, particularly for knights who served in the king's most personal chambers. Knights selected for the highest honor of attending the king during his private moments, including bathing and using the toilet facilities, such as they were in medieval times, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to maintain eye contact, or at least face the king during these intimate activities. Some historical accounts describe knights developing elaborate systems of movements to navigate royal chambers without ever turning their backs, essentially shuffling sideways like crabs when they needed to move around. This rule created particular complications during royal processions or movements through narrow castle corridors. Knights might have to walk backward for considerable distances, a practice that not only looked ridiculous, but was genuinely hazardous in medieval castles with their uneven floors and steep winding stairs. Stories exist of unfortunate knights who, in their determination to follow this rule perfectly, suffered falls or collisions while walking backward in front of their king. The bathroom application of this rule wasn't just awkward, it was also a security measure. The king was considered particularly vulnerable during private moments, and having trusted knights facing him at all times provided protection against assassination attempts. Several medieval chronicles record instances where plots against monarchs were foiled precisely because loyal knights were present and facing the king during supposedly private moments. For knights assigned to royal bathroom duty, the position was simultaneously prestigious and mortifying. While it indicated the highest level of trust from the sovereign, it also meant enduring incredibly uncomfortable social situations on a daily basis. Some knights reportedly used this intimate access to gain political advantages, using those private moments to whisper advice or requests directly to the king's ear when no other courtiers were present. Number 3. Never send private letters without your lord's permission. Was medieval communication monitored like modern social media? In ways that might feel surprisingly familiar to us today, knights lived under strict surveillance of their written communications. According to several chivalric codes, knights were forbidden from sending private letters or written messages without first obtaining permission from their lord or liege. This rule effectively eliminated the concept of private correspondence for knights. Any letter, note, or message they wished to send, whether to family members, friends, romantic interests, or business associates, had to be reviewed and approved by their superior. In many cases, this meant that the content of their letters would be read by their lord or his designated officials before being sealed and sent. The justification for this invasive practice was rooted in concerns about loyalty and security. Knights possessed sensitive information about castle defenses, troop movements, and political matters. Unrestricted communication could potentially allow a disloyal knight to pass information to enemies or conspire against his lord. By monitoring all outgoing messages, lords could theoretically prevent treason and ensure communications aligned with their interests. For knights, this restriction created significant practical problems. Something as simple as writing to inform their family of their whereabouts or managing distant properties required going through formal channels and potentially exposing private matters to scrutiny. Romantic correspondence became particularly complicated. Love letters from knights often had to pass through the hands of their lords before reaching their intended recipients. Clever knights developed various workarounds for this inconvenient rule. Some maintained networks of trusted messengers who would deliver verbal messages rather than written ones. Others developed simple codes or references that would be meaningful to the recipient but seem innocuous to anyone reviewing the letter. Some historical records even mention knights arranging with sympathetic monks or clergy, who were generally exempt from such scrutiny, to handle their most private correspondence. The restrictions around written communication extended beyond just outgoing messages. Knights were also expected to report any letters they received and share their contents with their lords. This created a culture where knights had to carefully consider everything they put in writing, knowing that their words might be read by unintended eyes. Number 2. Never allow a woman to be insulted in your presence. Did medieval knights really defend women's honor, as depicted in romantic tales? The historical record shows that this chivalric requirement was indeed real, though much more complex in practice than pop culture suggests. Knights were explicitly forbidden from allowing any woman, regardless of her social status, to be insulted or disrespected in their presence. This rule was among the most widely emphasized across different chivalric codes and manuals. Knights were expected to immediately intervene if they witnessed a woman being verbally abused, threatened, or insulted, even if doing so meant challenging someone of higher social status than themselves. This obligation extended to all women, not just noble women or those of their own class, at least in theory. The practical application of this rule created some fascinating social dynamics. Knights would sometimes find themselves in the awkward position of having to defend the honor of women they didn't know against men who might be their friends, relatives, or important political allies. Historical court records contain numerous accounts of knights challenging others to duels after overhearing insulting remarks about women. This chivalric obligation wasn't limited to physical or verbal defense. Knights were also expected to speak well of women in general, never participating in crude jokes or disrespectful conversation, even in all-male spaces. Some chivalric manuals specifically warned knights against engaging in tavern talk about women, considering such behavior unworthy of their status, regardless of who might overhear. What makes this rule particularly interesting is how it contrasted with the actual legal and social status of women in medieval society. While knights were obligated to defend women's honor, women themselves had few legal rights and were generally considered subordinate to men. This created a paradoxical situation where knights vigorously defended the dignity of individuals who were systematically denied agency in other contexts. The rule also had some noteworthy exceptions and limitations. Knights serving as judges or in legal capacities might find themselves in situations where they were required to pronounce judgment on women accused of crimes, creating tension with their chivalric obligation to defend female honor. Some chivalric manuals provided specific guidance for these situations, attempting to reconcile these conflicting duties. Number 1. Never reveal the details of a private conversation with your lord. Can you keep a secret? For medieval knights, discretion wasn't just valued, it was mandatory. Perhaps the most fundamental rule in the chivalric code was the absolute prohibition against revealing the contents of private conversations with one's lord or king. This requirement for secrecy formed the bedrock of the trust relationship between knights and their superiors. The rule was straightforward but absolute. Anything discussed in private with one's lord, whether strategic plans, personal matters, or casual conversation, was to remain completely confidential. Knights who violated this trust by gossiping or revealing sensitive information faced severe consequences, including loss of status, expulsion from court, or even charges of treason in extreme cases. This obligation for discretion created a unique role for knights in medieval power structures. They often served as confidants and sounding boards for their lords, hearing political strategies, personal confessions, and unfiltered opinions that were never intended for broader circulation. Historical records mention kings specifically testing new knights by sharing minor secrets to gauge their reliability before trusting them with more significant matters. The secrecy requirement extended beyond just conversations. It included anything a knight might witness while in private service to his lord. Knights who attended their lords in bedchambers or private studies were expected to develop selective amnesia about potentially embarrassing or politically sensitive behaviors they observed. This created an unusual dynamic where knights possessed enormous potential power through their knowledge, yet were bound by their code never to use it. For ambitious knights, this rule created both opportunities and constraints. Those who developed reputations for absolute discretion often rose quickly through the ranks, gaining access to increasingly sensitive information and greater responsibility. However, the same knights found themselves unable to leverage their insider knowledge for personal advantage without violating their chivalric oaths. The extreme importance placed on this rule helps explain why betrayal by a trusted knight was considered so heinous in medieval society. When a knight broke confidence and revealed private information, it wasn't just seen as gossip. It represented a fundamental breach of the social contract that underpinned feudal relationships. Chronicles from the period describe incidents of knights breaking confidence in terms usually reserved for the most serious crimes. What's particularly fascinating about this rule is how it shaped the broader culture of medieval courts. With knights bound to silence about private matters, kings and lords could maintain different public and private personaes. They could express doubts, fears, or unconventional ideas privately, while maintaining whatever image they wished to project publicly, knowing their knights would never reveal the contradiction. Ever wondered if you could have handled all these strange rules if you'd been born a medieval knight? The elaborate code of chivalry created a life that was part military discipline, part courtly etiquette, and entirely unlike anything we experience today. Would you have thrived under these bizarre restrictions, or would you have been the knight who got caught eating garlic before dancing with the duke's daughter?